Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I want to thank you all for joining us from across the globe for this important and timely conversation. Thanks to our members and partners and for all of you joining us via YouTube for today's On the Record program. This event is part of the Council's Women, Equity, and Global Development Forum. So I want to thank our sponsors that are supporting our work here. We'll take questions from the audience, so please go to ccga.live and submit any question or vote on questions that have already been submitted. Just to remind everyone, we are a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan organization, and therefore the views expressed by individuals we host on our platform do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Council. Well, on to our topic of today. Today marks exactly 1 week since Russia invaded Ukraine. We are witnessing a suffering, a devastation, and a rapidly unfolding humanitarian crisis. 1 million refugees have already fled Ukraine. More than 160,000 people are internally displaced. And the UNHCR now projects nearly 4 million refugees likely to leave Ukraine in the coming weeks. That still leaves many, many millions inside Ukraine itself. As the conflict is intensifying, civilians are being bombed indiscriminately. We're seeing actions that are akin to war crimes, and the civilian toll and trauma that is taking place is rising daily, even though it is difficult to completely assess everything that's going on. Civilian protection in war is always paramount. Along with making sure that we can provide critical humanitarian aid and supplies to the people in need. This is not only a political and humanitarian crisis, however, but it is a crisis of our morality. Human rights and international rule of law must be protected, they must be upheld, and we cannot be complacent in a time like this. Yesterday, the UN General Assembly overwhelmingly voted in favor of a resolution reprimanding Russia for the invasion and demanding that they stop fighting and withdraw all military forces from all of Ukraine. A prolonged conflict will have profound humanitarian consequences, but also geopolitical impact. The world is watching. Russia must be held accountable for its actions. We must build on this unity, which is critical to diplomacy and to democracy. And our values, ideals, and democracy are at stake. The age of impunity that David Miliband has written about must come to an end. It's therefore my great honor to introduce today's panelists, who are champions of human rights and democracy and the rule of law, to discuss the scope of the crisis, what is being done to mobilize aid and international support, and what's needed and lies ahead. Luckily for me, they're also among my best friends, among great friends of ours. So with that, let me introduce the panel today. Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein is President and CEO of the International Peace Institute and the Perry Worldhouse Professor of the Practice of Law and Human Rights at the University of Pennsylvania. He previously served as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as Jordan's ambassador to the United Nations, as well as ambassador to the United States. He is also a member of the Elders, an independent group of global leaders working together for peace, justice, and human rights that was founded by Nelson Mandela. Ertharin Cousin is a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a visiting scholar at the Stanford University Center on Food Security Environment in the Freeman Spogli Institute, and the founder and CEO of Food Systems for the Future. She led the world's largest humanitarian organization, the World Food Program, which has a staff of 14,000 that serve 80 million vulnerable people across 75 countries. Finally, we're being joined by David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, where he oversees the agency operations in 40 crisis-affected countries and his refugee resettlement and assistance program throughout Europe and the Americas. He previously served as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs for the United Kingdom. In 2016, he was named one of the world's greatest leaders by Fortune magazine, and in 2018, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Thank you all three for joining us for this really important conversation. As I mentioned, the UNHCR now estimates that 1 million refugees have fled Ukraine for neighboring countries since Russia's attack. while warning that 4 million more may reach outside of Ukraine in the coming days. We're facing an incredible humanitarian crisis already inside Ukraine: food, water, medicine shortages, as well as indiscriminate bombings. Ertharin, let me start with you. Speak about the current situation and how you assess where the humanitarian need is today before we go into some of the specifics.
Well, thank you very much, Ivo, for inviting me to participate in this very timely and very important conversation. And thank you to the Chicago Council for hosting this event. The civilians are always pay the highest price. When we talk about those who are food insecure, acutely food insecure in the world today, what drives acute food insecurity more than any other factor is conflict. And that is true now in the Ukraine. So what do we do about it? A successful humanitarian response during times of conflict requires presence, access, adequate timely funding, and operational capacity, as well as, of course, legal, as well as de facto protection for humanitarian actors. From a present standpoint, the UN and all of the international NGOs that support the activities that need to occur in response to a humanitarian challenge are on the ground and performing work. What's also really important about the response that is taking place both in the Ukraine and in the neighboring countries are the number of local organizations that are providing the support to their neighbors. When we talk about the presence is there. The access is becoming more challenging inside the country as you have indiscriminate bombings that are occurring inside the country. The challenge of humanitarian, whether multinationals, UN, or local actors, is becoming ever more of a challenge, which as a result, you are seeing more people fleeing for their security, as well as to receive the life-saving support that is necessary for them to continue to thrive during this conflict. And so the UN is coming together with the international response community to address that access challenge. In a situation like this, it's hard to talk about bright spots, but let me talk about a bright spot. The UN initiated an emergency appeal of $1.7 billion. Within days, they'd raised $1.5 billion. This is unprecedented. We've never had the global community come together to provide the financial resources that are necessary in this timely of a manner to allow for the scale up of all of the actors that are providing the assistance that is required. So this is that I say this with a level of caution, because this is just the beginning of the scale up. This is what I often call the CNN effect, where the generosity of the international community is overflowing during the time that a conflict is initiated, and the coverage from the international media is high. If this conflict continues to drag on, as we say, and the cameras turn off, we begin to see the challenges like those we see in Yemen and Afghanistan and Somalia and many other places to list, where there's not enough financial support for that presence and even where you have access for those actors to provide the assistance that is required. So the community's coming together, the finances for that initial scale up are on the ground, the community, for what is exciting, is working in coordination. You have the UN leading, but you have participation in the planning by all actors, particularly those local actors, which is so critical to an effective response. So from a humanitarian standpoint, people are suffering, but the humanitarian community is responding to meet the needs of that suffering. But the only action that will fully meet the needs of that suffering is for us to stop the violence, to stop the conflict, and for the political issues to be addressed and to avoid the humanitarian and the human effects of this crisis.
Thanks, Ertharin. I think this UN angle and what it is doing is heartening. But as you say, we're only 7 days into this conflict. Zeid, when you look at the last 7 days, what are you worried about most that is happening on the humanitarian side that is perhaps being missed or that ought to be highlighted more? How do you assess the current the situation as it is?
Well, thank you, Ivo. First of all, I join Ertharin, and it's lovely to be with you, and David and Ertharin are on this day, although, as you said, I mean, the conditions in Ukraine are so frightful and so dangerous, given how we're only a few mistakes away from potentially a third world war if there's any encroachment on any NATO territory as a result of what we're seeing in place. Strange as it seems, I see Zelensky's asking for a ceasefire. If you don't have a ceasefire accompanied by a mechanism for disengagement of the forces and withdrawal of forces, the ceasefire politically only serves the aggressor. And while there's a humanitarian need to save lives, politically it would be disastrous to just have a ceasefire for the sake of it. Unfortunately, we're caught in a real trap here. The pretext, of course, used by President Putin amount to just fat lies. My old office, the UN office in Ukraine, has issued 33 or 32 reports over the last 7 years, and it sort of catalogs all the violations on all sides in Ukraine. And there is no casus belli, as we know. This is a war that has been long in the making, going back to 2007, 2008, maybe well before that. And its consequences are just horrific. We have to, I think, now think very clearly about what it is that we want to happen. Any freezing, as I said, of the situation where it stands now, without an accompaniment of the right mechanisms and measures to ensure the withdrawal of Russian forces would be catastrophic for Ukraine and the region beyond. But likewise, we need to ensure somehow that accountability, even for the reasons that you cited and David has spoken about openly and very vocally, need to be in place this time. But it's going to be tough, and we'll get into it in a short time.
David, how do you see it? I'm sure IRC is already on the ground, has been on the ground for a long time already. So you have on the ground reporting that's different and complementary to what we see on television. How do you see the situation? How worried should we really be about what's happening inside the country as all the focus seems to have been on the refugees, which is important and critical, how they need to be absorbed. But how do you see it?
Thanks, Ivo. I've just got off the phone off the Zoom with my colleagues in Poland, so happy to relay. I think the way to, and obviously my colleagues Ertharin and Zeid have spoken brilliantly about the situation. I agree with what they said. There are 4 fronts, I think, to the humanitarian effort, or 4 specifics that I would add. First of all, there are places under siege where there is obviously death and destruction, but also injury, and a growing strangulation, heat supplies being cut off, water being cut off, etc. We know these siege tactics. You know them well from the Balkans in the 1990s. They've also been used in Syria and elsewhere. So alongside the sort of pulverization of the missiles, etc., there is the squeeze. And so in a squeeze situation like that, the most vulnerable are at greatest risk. So we're very concerned about health and pharmaceutical supplies. We're obviously concerned about water supplies. Eventually, we'll be concerned about food supplies as stocks run out. Secondly, you've got people on the move inside Ukraine. There are no good figures on this, obviously, because they've not crossed a border, so they're not being counted. There was a figure earlier in the week of 160,000, which was a way underestimate. There must be at least, I would say there are more people on the move inside the country than have yet crossed over the borders. Stands to reason, really. They're moving west towards safety, although, of course, there are some men going the other way towards the fighting in an extraordinary display of national sort of civic patriotism. But the second group are those who are on the move. There's a lot of trauma amongst those. There's a lot of community support, but they will eventually stop, probably somewhere inside the country. Some of them will move on. But there's a second group that's the IDPs, the internally displaced. Thirdly, there are the refugees. Obviously, they've reached the world's largest, richest single market. They're in Poland, Hungary. So I don't want to say they're the lucky ones because there's a huge amount of trauma there, but they are being processed quickly through reception centers. I heard this morning that the lines at the border are much reduced on what existed before. I've also been very concerned about reports that there was discrimination against African or South Asian people trying to move. At least I've heard that there's been some shift on the European side of the border or on the EU side of the border. So hopefully that is being addressed. And then the fourth group is that there are people who are already moving on once they land in Poland and Hungary. Obviously, the experience of refugee crises is that people stay closest to where to their own country. So I think we can expect the majority to stay in Eastern Europe, but there are people moving on to Italy, Germany, etc. And that's natural, and they need proper support. Just one other point, because I don't want to go on for too long. I mean, Ertharin makes an incredibly important point about the UN appeal and the response to it. But I want to really put on the table, I mean, we cannot have a situation where the clients of IRC in Syria or in Somalia or in Ethiopia or in Yemen or in Afghanistan, some of whom are literally on the verge of famine, end up paying the price of the world's quote unquote generosity for the Ukraine crisis. And there's a danger that we slip over. I think Ertharin used the word unprecedented. I mean, the point is we should welcome the fast response to the Ukraine crisis financially, but we should deplore the fact that there's half or a third of the estimated funding needs being met in those other crises. And I think that's going to be an increase. I mean, it would be beyond a scandal if there was a tilting of the balance away from Afghans in trouble or Yemenis in trouble in order to serve Ukrainians in trouble.
Ertharin, I want to come to you in a second, and just to remind our audience that you can ask a question by going to ccja.live into your browser, type a question, vote for one, and we'll get to it in a little bit. But Ertharin, to David's last point, the food security crisis that exists globally in the conflicts that David has talked about, Ethiopia, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, and the humanitarian crisis that's with it. Both Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers of food commodities. 14% of wheat, I think, comes out of the two countries, and even more on corn. This must have a major, almost immediate impact on the ability to provide food, let alone for those already destitute, those are not yet destitute. How should we look at this? What is the role of an organization like the World Food Program to address this in a more global sense? Because there's an immediate food crisis, as we know, in Ukraine because of lack of resources. We're finding Russians don't have enough food to take that they took along. But the wider implication that David talked about is real and not to be forgotten.
There's a lot to unpack there, Ivo, in the question that you just asked. Let me begin by saying that from a humanitarian standpoint, and the WFP, the organization that I once led, the number one provider of wheat, where the supplier of wheat to WFP is the Ukraine. 50% of all the wheat that is distributed by the WFP comes from Ukraine. But also, in addition to the humanitarian challenge of access to that commodity that the institution depends upon, you also have 50% of all of the cereals in North Africa and the Middle East are imported from from Ukraine and Russia. And what you can anticipate as we move forward is higher prices. As availability reduces, you can expect higher prices, which will have an effect on the humanitarian responses in some of those other places that we've been talking about, and the ability to have the capital that is necessary to provide the food assistance that's required for those who, using David's term, are living on the verge of starvation today in places like Yemen and Afghanistan and northeast Nigeria. And you compound that potentially with higher spike in prices in other cities across Africa and the Middle East that could potentially result in the types of high food price spikes that we saw in 2007, 2008 that resulted in 40 riots across cities across the globe when people could not afford access to enough food to feed their families. So there is a potential global effect, both in the humanitarian community as well as in the consumer populations across some of the most, particularly low and middle income countries. But because of the large amount of grains that are provided, that effect will not be limited over there. You can expect that as shortages affect global food markets, that you'll have high prices right here in the United States as well as we move forward.
At a time when inflation in the United States and in Europe and other places is already rising, a big war like this is not going to leave the world untouched, for sure. Zeid, I want to talk a little bit about the human rights situation in particular that we are seeing. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has already said that they're going to watch very closely what's happening, and they will have plans to investigate as rapidly as possible. I think everybody is taking notes of what's happening, which we can find on social media. How is the international system preparing for addressing the question of war crimes and the issue of accountability? I mentioned David's point on impunity. This is one of those areas where we need to hold people accountable. How do we need to think about it? What is being done, and what more do you think ought to be done in order to make sure that this doesn't happen?
Yes, well, certainly the seemingly indiscriminate attacks that are evident, of course, in Kiev, Kharkiv, in Mariupol, Kherson, of course, recently, Odessa, along with the massive destruction of the physical space, with little regard to the international law that applies, international humanitarian law, and the principles that under let's say this, that provide the scaffolding for that law: proportionality, distinction, necessity. It would seem to suggest, of course, that war crimes are being perpetrated. In terms of crimes against humanity, those normally will require more time before they can be discerned, because you have to connect widespread and systematic attacks, and it requires some understanding of how organization has led to those attacks. The crime of aggression, which is a command responsibility crime, is not yet prosecutable in the Ukrainian context, but we're looking into it very closely, and it's more complicated than first seems to meet meets the eye. While I understand why the Ukrainians would want to do it, I think their approach to the International Court of Justice with respect to the crime of genocide may be premature. Genocide is notoriously hard to prove, and it's very likely that the International Court of Justice will reject the approach, which would be, of course, damaging, to say the least. So it may need a further revision of thought, but one can understand why they're doing this. And because emotionally, of course, one has to respond to what one sees before one's own eyes and what one experiences. In answer to your second question, yes, of course, we need to collect as much physical evidence and make sure that it is of the sort that is admissible in a court of law. But we also need to go back to David's point. We need to assure that there is some moral consistency in the way that we approach all these different conflicts. We simply can't continue with the hypocrisy and double standards. I mean, essentially, states need to grow up and be intellectually honest. It's not right for Arab states, for example, to be outraged by what happens in Palestine, Israel, but then remain quiet with respect to Yemen, or for the US to have been, outraged by Russian, Iranian, Syrian actions in Syria, but the US, of course, has long remained silent on what's happened in Palestine as a result of Israeli actions. And similarly, and so forth, you can go across to many of these conflicts and see the same thing. So moral consistency is something that we need desperately, I think, in this respect. And of course, the people of Idlib and Aleppo know fully well what the people of Mariupol are going through now. So these sorts of crimes, have been committed in other contexts, and we're still slow, as you suggest, to prosecute them. Finally, with respect to the ICC, yes, they will be exercising jurisdiction over crimes against humanity and war crimes. It is essential that the prosecutor looks at all crimes, no matter who the author is, and that there be no suggestion of any political game being played. There were concerns that this was or has been the case recently when it came to the prosecutor's announcements or sort of policy announcement regarding his approach to the Taliban. And I hope that won't be repeated in the context of Ukraine.
David, partly with your old hat, partly with your new hat, old hat as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs in the UK, you wrote in the New York Times about the importance of consistency, which Zeid just talked about as well. What we're seeing in Europe in terms of the response to the crisis is pretty remarkable. Things have changed very quickly. Germany sending arms to countries in conflict, the EU doing things that we haven't seen, the welcoming of refugees, compare that to 2015. Perhaps, as you mentioned, it's easier to open doors to people with white skins than people who don't have white skins, and that's an issue that you raised and needs to be raised. But I wonder is this a moment where we may be able to do a real turning point in the way that both you said is necessary, but all of us think might be possible? Is there a possibility for a new consensus that the shock that the system is absorbing right now leads people to say we need to think about this not just in the singular case of Ukraine, but in the broader case of how do we bring consistency, morality, human rights to the fore, and the rule of law? How do you look at this moment from that humanitarian perspective?
Well, I think new consensus would be a very grand claim, but I think that what we know already is that this has been a historic week. It's been a week in which taboos have been slayed, if that's what you do with taboos, in the most remarkable way. It's been an extraordinary wake-up call, I think, for complacency in Europe, and European nations, European leaders have stood up and they've discovered things about themselves and their capacities that they didn't know existed, from a sense that, Russia's got $630 billion worth of exchange reserves, there's nothing to be done, to we're not going to take this lying down and we're going to throw every conceivable weapon at our disposal at this problem because the stakes are very, very high. So I think that this has been a historic moment. I think there are two aspects that I would put on the table to try to look into this, but I want to do that with a very big caveat. The caveat is what happens on the ground in Ukraine is going to be dispositive. We don't yet know if Ukraine is going to be a partitioned country, an occupied country. We don't know what's going to happen in Russia. some extraordinary scenes from across Russia. So with that caveat in place, I just want to put two things on the table. One is that the discovery of collective strength amongst liberal democratic nations has very significant consequences. From a sense in which history was being done to us, there's a new discovery that the countries of the political West, remember Joschka Fischer described the Atlantic Charter as the birth certificate of the West. The West is not a geographic concept, it's a political concept about liberal democratic values and nations. Now, these countries have significant strength, but they have to get their own house in order if they're going to use those strengths, get their own house in order to tackle hypocrisy in the way that Zeid has referred, get their own house in order in terms of the systems by which they talk to each other and the culture with which they talk to each other. Parenthesis, the Biden administration deserve big credit for the way they have engaged with other countries in a way that has been cooperative, collaborative, transparent, and has been not exactly humble, but has said, we're going to do this 10 times better if we do it together. And that's, I think, been very, very striking. So getting our own house in order is part of this. Then there's a question of how the is the global context. And the global context is very different than 30 years ago, to state the obvious. The playing field is tilted, if you like, against liberal democratic values. That's the idea behind my age of impunity, rather than in favor of them. But I think that the discovery of strength on the part of liberal democratic countries has been noticed. You can see that in the way the Chinese system is positioning itself around this crisis. And my own very strong view is that there's no time to lose in asserting and reasserting commitment, not just to the way we conduct ourselves, but the way we conduct ourselves in the international fora and what it means to have a rules-based international system. That is what is at issue here. And my payoff would be, in answer to your question, there's no room for kind of Dr. Pangloss, for rose-tinted spectacles when people are getting bombed out of their lives across Ukraine. But maybe, but there is the opportunity that the attempt to rewind the clock by 30 years, which is what the invasion represents, may actually prompt a rediscovery of the values of 30 years ago and the values that led people to break down the Berlin Wall. And I think that is, with all of the humility that comes from the mistakes of the last 30 years, the end of the Cold War was a victory of values, not just a victory of military might and dominance. And I think if you want to make your argument that that there's something can come out of this, it's definitely a defensive notion about how we defend our own institutions and nations, but it's also a bigger concept of how we engage in the global system, because there's only one global system, there's only one planet, and there's only one. Nuclear security is indivisible, the climate is indivisible, global health is indivisible. And that's a very important part of this. And so I think that there's an enormous responsibility on political leaders to make the defensive case, but also to make the bigger argument about how to take the right lessons from this.
I don't want to get political, but it would be nice to, David, that was quite a speech.
Sorry, I apologize.
No. I mean, I listen, I think this is, the moment calls for this, and the real question on earth, or not, someone who studied so closely the UN system, who's worked in the UN system, who has seen all of its faults, but also all of its strengths, because we in the United States in particular like to only talk about faults, but how much good gets done by that system. Do you think the system is ready to sort of take this next moment? And I recall sort of in some ways the post-1990-91 period, not only the end of the Cold War, but also the coalition that came together to oust Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, which is a similar, aggression of one country against another. And the world stood up and said, not going to do that. And the great hope that we have. Do you see the system, after 30 years of disappointment, I think is the right word, ready for taking on this value challenge in a concrete way? How do you look at it?
if you're asking me about the humanitarian and development system, I can answer
Yeah.
that. The political system.
No, the humanitarian and development system and
Thank you.
support and the political support that's necessary.
That is
for it to
necessary
work.
to support
Exactly,
the activities of the humanitarian development system. What has been exciting to watch, and as I've talked to friends across the different agencies in the system, is that all of the agencies are sending their best people into the Ukraine and into the surrounding countries because they've received the financial resources that are necessary. They're also scaling up, again, back to that word, unprecedented rate and speed to support the needs of those who are internally displaced, as well as those who, the now a million people who have crossed the border into neighboring countries. So the Secretary General has appointed a humanitarian and development coordinator to lead the entire team, both from the UN standpoint, as well as from the supporting the entire humanitarian community coming together. Because when we talk about the UN system, the beauty of when the system performs best is when it coordinates, collaborates, and communicates, not just across the agencies, but across the international NGOs, including the one that David leads, as well as those local actors. And I think one of the benefits of the response that is so important to underscore is the responsibility that Ukrainians are taking for their own humanitarian support, and the recognition by the system of the value of those local actors performing the work that is necessary, as well as the planning that is required to make that response effective to meet the needs of the population that is impacted by this political action. And so are they better prepared than they've ever been in the past? I believe yes. And I think the world will benefit from it. And most importantly, the Ukrainian people will benefit from the actions of the system as they continue to move forward.
That's great. Zeid, turn to the question of what now? What would you like to see happen in order to address the immediate humanitarian crisis in Ukraine that you are not either seeing or not seeing enough of in terms of the response? The response may have been remarkable, but what are you most worried about, and how do and what can be done to address it?
Yeah, I'm not really qualified to talk about the humanitarian side of this. It's more David and Ertharin. The human rights aspects of this are either preventative or it comes in the form of criminal accountability and ensuring that there is justice done to the victims once those violations take place. I think, look, of course, we need to somehow stem the bleeding and we need to stop the destruction. Unfortunately, having experienced this myself in the Balkans many years ago, if you just freeze the situation without a proper accounting for what happens on the ground and a full withdrawal of the forces of aggression, you're only creating another problem and paying down the track. It's not the equivalent of being crushed by the weight of the shelling that's taking place at the moment. But it's still something we have to be mindful of. My hope is that the international system is now thinking ahead of how it's going to put this together. There will be a point at which a ceasefire will be called. It's a very delicate point when that happens, because you only have so much space time-wise to then get the disengagement talks in place with a horizon for full withdrawal. But at what price? Are you going to offer an amnesty to Putin as a price for the cessation of hostilities? In the current climate, I can't see that happening. So what will have to be offered? As David said, do we accept a partition of Ukraine, perhaps the whole Donbass and more than that? But that would be seen as providing him with some sort of prize, and certainly not something that I think Europe is in a mood for. So it requires now some very careful thinking and very forceful, using the energy that David spoke about that is present in Europe, the sort of forcefulness, but also some very delicate sort of thinking as to how one approaches this. Just finally on the point that Ertharin raised, I would disagree with her. I don't often disagree with her, but I disagree with her on whether the UN is stronger now than it used to be. It's been browbeaten over the last few decades, and not just by the Russians, but by many other states. Now I think it's almost all states assert their power over the Secretariat in a way that's extremely unhealthy. And it has to find its voice and realize that the UN, aside from the member states, is an independent actor, can say things, can push back, can be critical in a way that we've seen the Secretary General recently with respect to Ukraine, but he seldom is with respect to the other crises, speaking out openly and without fear or favor. And I think that's perhaps what we're now looking for. And the hope is that there will be an intelligent approach to resolving the crisis in Ukraine.
Important, yes, Ertharin.
Very quickly, I just need to say I don't disagree with Zeid at all about the political challenges that the UN is facing today. But I think there's a distinction between the humanitarian actors and the agencies that are UN institutions and the work that they're performing. And I think that they continue to deliver. And what we are witnessing now in the Ukraine is that they are delivering today.
No, I think that's fair, and I think those points are on the mark. And Zeid's point repeated from earlier that ceasefires aren't necessarily always a great thing. That you have to think about the political balance that comes with that ceasefire is well taken. David, to you, final word here. You talked about the strangulation of the cities that are coming up. We've seen strangulation tactics before in Syria and other places. We have never seen the international community doing a hell of a lot about it. Is this going to be different? Do you see this situation as the pictures are going to come from the strangulation plus the bombardment that comes with it, that there might be a different response? And if so, how would that work?
Well, that's a very deep question. I think that there's striking recent experience where the attempted strangulation of the northwest of Syria hasn't actually worked, and Russian and Syrian forces have not known how to retake an area. That's important. Now, it's not being held by liberal Democrats in the northwest of Syria, but it's important to know that. Equally, you go back 25 years to the Balkans, and sieges of cities did strangle people, literally as well as metaphorically. And fighting your way in is a very, very big bridge to cross in that, as you know from your own public service and writing. I think that we mustn't fall victim to assuming that the best we've got to plan for the worst. And I think the readout from the French president's call today was France is preparing for the worst. And I think it will be, I don't want to be glib in saying to you, yes, we know how to do this. I think we're getting set for something which has very, very dark days ahead of it in the short to medium term, especially dark if you're Ukrainian, trapped in these cities. So I think the maybe one piece of specific that I would give is that it's all happened so fast that one would fear that the international agencies would be left sort of miles behind. That hasn't actually happened. And our lesson from the IRC's lesson from previous crises is if you're not in there at the beginning, it's very hard to get in. But I'm quite struck talking to some of my colleagues on the ground, not just in respect of the refugees, that's one thing, but inside Ukraine, there's real planning and preparation going ahead, including by much bigger agencies than ours. I mean, Ertharin's colleagues at the World Food Programme and elsewhere. And so what I would say is the critical task, this isn't a prediction, this is a task, is to be really cold-eyed and about what's needed and to be there early. And it's not very complicated. Water, pharmaceuticals, food, the basics for survival. The avenues for that have got to be established very early, and the partners on the ground have got to be established very early. And I think there is recognition of that.
Yeah, I was talking to someone the other day, just yesterday, about what some of the hotels that are still operating are doing in Kyiv, and all the bathtubs are full of water, all the swimming pool is full of water, just preparing exactly as you're saying. Dark days ahead for sure, but I can't think of three better people to shed light on that darkness than Ertharin Cousins, Zeid Al Hussein, and David Miliband. Thanks so much for a really terrific conversation. I want to get you back when the situation isn't as dark as it is, but those, unfortunately, we live on crises. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Continue to visit our website, thechicagoCouncil.org, for more and up-to-date information on Ukraine. Thank you all, and we will see you hopefully soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.